Amen. As we get started, we're going to be going to Daniel chapter 6, beginning that chapter here this morning. We'll probably finish it this morning as well. It's not a very long chapter. Let me just ask you a question here this morning. Do you believe that all things are possible with God? Do you believe that? Do you think that some of these things that we're studying in the book of Daniel might just be really good stories to kind of make a point? Or are they something that really did happen? These are things that really happened, aren't they? And so the book of Daniel, I think, by God's grace, is a very unique book in so many different ways. We think about it oftentimes concerning just the simple thing of how it's sort of the revelation of the Old Testament and how we need to know it to know what Revelation has to say in the New Testament, things of that nature. But the book itself and what it teaches us about faith and about living by faith in impossible circumstances and in tremendous challenges is really something for us to consider. And we see that over and over again throughout the book of Daniel. And we should consider that very carefully this morning. As we look at, and I just want to finish up with this. We have been, of course, studying in chapter 5, and I was kind of going on with Babylon, and I just told one person this morning that we could keep doing that. But the problem is, I'm going to end up teaching the book of the Revelation like that or something, we'll never get back to Daniel. I think we've said enough at this point for the purpose of Daniel of simply saying this, that we can see how important Babylon is for a Christian to understand, because it plays a role in our dispensation as well, doesn't it? And it will be right through the time of the end. But now, this morning, I would like to begin as we begin in just verse 1, okay? Daniel chapter 6 and verse 1. It says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. And over these three presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the prince might give an account unto them, and the king should have no damage. Then Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, and became because an excellent spirit was found in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm." Now, when we think about this chapter, let's again look at it. This is where we're introduced into the Second World Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire. You may recall. The head of gold is whom? It's Nebuchadnezzar, right? And it's Babylon. So we know that. And we look at the time of the Gentiles. The one that follows that was the arm and the breast of silver of the image. Now, if we went back and we just dropped back to chapter 2 for a moment here this morning, we'll just look at the quick interpretation of that so we can kind of get a picture of what's going on. This is all one book, isn't it? And it all ties together. Now we go back to Nebuchadnezzar, and we find that what God had given Nebuchadnezzar, a picture of what was going to come during the time of the Gentiles, until the time of when the time of the Gentiles will end, when all of this is going to end, and the Lord is going to come back and set His kingdom up in the world. So in Daniel chapter 2, we look at starting in verse 21. Daniel interprets this for the King Nebuchadnezzar. And he says, "Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This image, this great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. The image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, and his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, that were of iron and clay, and broke them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the shaft of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them, and that the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth." We, of course, studied all this, but real quickly, what we wanted to see here was in verse 32, when it says, "His breast and arms of silver." The breast and the arms, of course, we know there's two arms, right? Medo-Persian Empire. We get that idea there. And then, of course, it goes on. We're going to look at the belly a little later in our study, particularly when we get to, I believe, around chapter 10. But that's going to be That's going to be Alexander the Great. The iron and the clay and the feet are described in the Bible as the beast. It doesn't name it per se, but we know it to be the Roman Empire. And the last one that we saw there is what? The stone that comes down with a stone. What is that stone? That's Christ himself, isn't it? When he comes and he shatters it. But please notice that includes all of those empires. All of them are in that. And the Roman Empire is going to consist of basically all of the empires at the time of this. And we see how that's going to be destroyed. And what's going to happen? A great mountain is going to come up, and it's going to encompass the whole earth. And there's going to be righteousness set up upon this world. So we see that coming to come. But now going back. So the events of this chapter take place after, of course, the fall of Babylon. Darius took the throne immediately after Babylon fell, and he ruled for only 2 years. And then Cyrus comes back and rules again. But Daniel, when we think about it, he would have only been around 90 years old, just a whippersnapper at that point, right? Can you imagine at 90 years old? Some of us can get a little closer to imagining that. But being 90 years old at that time, and it was remarkable that Daniel at this age was able to even consider doing such a task. But again, with God, all things are possible, aren't they? With God, all things are possible. And we see this is true here. And so we see Darius made Daniel, not only was he recognized, not only was one of the 3 presidents, but also he was called their chief. In other words, he was head over everything. And we saw as we had begun our reading that there's 120 providences that there are out there. So he had 120 presidents, and then there was him, these 3, and then he was the head of the 3 that were there, including, of course, he made up one of those himself. And you know something, if we look at this verse, looking at verse 3, it says, the king thought to set him over the whole realm. We can see that he even considered making Daniel the vice regent. Can you imagine that? The vice regent. Now, how did he know about Daniel? We don't know all that he knew about Daniel, but he obviously knew a lot. And maybe he had heard about him, as we talked about. Of course, Isaiah, what he had said about what would happen with Babylon, he could have known all those things. But I also think about this just from a physical standpoint, or we might say worldly standpoint. Who was in charge after the defeat of Babylon? Who was over the whole Babylon Empire at that particular moment? No, I'm saying Babylon, over Babylon. It was Daniel. Remember the writing on the wall and what happened? What happened? When he interpreted that, the king did what? He made him the 3rd ruler in the country. And of course, his dad was no longer ruling. He was done. He was killed. He was killed. So who was it left? It left Daniel. Of course, it was a very short rule. Matter of hours, probably. But it also mentions, I thought to myself, that would mean that if when Cyrus came in and Darius came in, who would they be dealing with? Well, they would deal with whoever was left in charge. And that would have been Daniel. That's how he got to know Daniel probably so well, just in my way of thinking. That is purely speculation on my part, guys. So it's not from the Word of God. But we don't know why Darius did this. We're not really told. However, we are told in verse 3, I want you to notice something that he does say. The Word of God says in verse 3, says, Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes because, why? An excellent spirit was found in him. What's an excellent spirit? It's integrity, my friends. It's true integrity. A man of truth. A man of true integrity is what he found. Remember that at the time of the fall of Babylon, Daniel was made the ruler. We just talked about that, and that put him in a position probably to know Darius. Darius might have, in some ways, become acquainted with Daniel's integrity and superior statesmanship through all that. So even though we can't maybe answer that particular, but we can know the why, and we just mentioned that. We know, as we see in verse 3, when it says, then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and the princes because what? An excellent spirit was found in him, and the king's thought to set him over the whole realm. Now that's a real blessing, isn't it? But now, wait a minute, I say it's a real blessing, but is it a real blessing? I think Daniel would have been just as happy to probably stay retired myself, but I don't know that. But anyway, just think about this for a minute. This really didn't set well with it, did it? With all the other presidents and princes, they would have been filled with both envy and fear. Why would they fear Daniel? Because he was a man of integrity, that's why. That was not what they were used to. They were used to being able to take advantage of their positions to pad their own pockets, basically, and do the things that they wanted to do. You couldn't do that with Daniel. And I think that they understood that very early. You see, it was well known that Daniel would not stand for any graft or dishonesty. And they didn't want to lose their position or the opportunity for their gain. So they sought to find some malfeasance or charge against the Jew. And I use the word Jew here because they think about it. The Jews have never been popular, have they? They wanted to make a point. This is a Jew. No, that's not even just a foreigner, but he's a Jew. And he's being put in this high position. They didn't like this a bit. But you know something? They found no occasion or fault. I believe they went all the way through the time of when it was through the Babylonian era to try to see where if they could find something in there he did wrong or something they could find fault with. They couldn't. I think we can just consider the fact of Daniel's magnificent testimony before and among the unsaved. You know something? They might hate him, but what are they hating him for? Are they hating him for the right reasons? Why do they hate Christians today? Why do they hate Christians today? Why did they hate Jesus Christ? Think about it just a minute. So we need to understand that persecution is a real thing for children of God, children of integrity, children of truth. And we can see this even back then. These are some of the things I think we should take away from our study of Daniel, is understanding how important it is to take a stand for the Lord. And to know that we can stand for the Lord. Because our Lord is above all. Yeah, these conspirators, they had to hatch a hellacious and diabolical plot. They determined to do this. Now looking at verse 4, he goes on to say, Then the presidents and the princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. The Bible says, but they could find none, occasion or fault, as much as he was faithful. Neither was there any error or fault found in him. Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the laws of his God. Then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king and said unto him, King Darius, live forever. Please notice the word all in verse 7. All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, the counselors and the captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make thee a firm decree that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing, that it be not changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. Wherefore, King Darius signed the writing and the decree. Wow. A lot there, isn't there, my friends? A lot there to consider. When we look at this, I just want you to notice the word all specifically. That's important. That's important. We'll see that as we go a little further. The plot, I think we can say, reveals the cunningness of the serpent. It has Satan written all over it. The deception, the dishonesty, the falseness. It was not all, was it? They knew Daniel. They knew the depths of his faith and faithfulness. And that nothing would cause him to be disloyal to his God. They knew that. Again, speaking of the testimony, even to the unsaved, they knew this about Daniel. They knew how he was about his God. And I'm sure at that point in time, many were very much aware of some of the things that had taken place with Nebuchadnezzar, including Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what they had been through, thrown into the fiery furnace, of the king being 7 years, living as an ox out in the wild, all of those things they had been aware of, and what happened with Darius. I mean, with Belshazzar on that last day. All of that, they would have been very much aware. There was so much obvious evidence about who the Lord was. Yes. If they could get the king to just simply make a decree, they knew, he would have to abide to it once it was made. It could not be changed under the law of the Medes and the Persians. A decree once made could not be revoked. This was unique. It wasn't like with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar could change his mind if he wanted to, couldn't he? He was an absolute monarch. He was the absolute law. There was no other thing. But with the Medes and the Persians, they had this thing about if once a decree was made and signed in as the law of the Medes and the Persians, that could not be altered in any way. We see that in the book of Esther as well. You may remember Haman. He ended up building a big gallows to hang Mordecai. He was going to hang Mordecai, right? And he was going to kill off all the Jews. He got it all done. He thought he was all done. Boy, he was just so proud of himself. And what happened? Well, the king couldn't change the decree that he had made because he got him to sign the decree. But what the king did, because of Esther, she got him to make another decree giving the Jews the right to defend themselves and to go against them. And so that turned the whole thing around. And guess who got hung from those gallows? Okay, so I'm just saying we see how strong this law was. Something to keep in mind. Yeah, he told them all these things. So we see this decree was irrevocable. Now when the king with lying tongues went into the presence of the king and told him that all the presidents, governors, and princes, and counselors, and captains, as we see in verse 7, they were the word all, of course, had consulted together to establish a royal decree. This was a lie. And Daniel, the chief of the presidents, had not been consulted. We know they lied. Now, as I look at that, I thought so much about this. I thought, think how much hatred there was here. And how they had gone to deceive the king to this extent to try to get rid of Daniel. And we can also think of Darius. He was a good king in many ways, wasn't he? I like Darius. I read him, I think, boy, what a good man he was. He does so much, including we're going to see later, he'll actually he's the one who releases the Jews to go back to their own land. But what got into him? You know that attitude that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely? Do you not think maybe you can just get a head that's about this big, and over time when you find out that you really can everything, it gets about that big? And here they were talking about worshiping him. He was going to be worshipped as a god, and back in those days, a lot of emperors were. So all of this was just a real flattering thing to him. Wow, and they're asking me for this. I'm not telling them that's what they have to do. They're asking me to do this. We can kind of envision some of these things. This was a lie. But Darius was mostly flattered by the proposal, for in those days it was not uncommon to look upon the king as God. So Darius, not knowing that Daniel, whom he really loved, had not been consulted and fell into their trap, he signed and stamped it with the royal seal and publicly, please notice, proclaimed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, and therefore it became unalterable. There was no way to alter this. Daniel had to make a choice. He had to choose between his loyalty to God or his loyalty to the king. Should he be faithful to his God and thus save his own life? I mean, after all, can't we see Daniel saying, well, I probably should do this. I can just set this aside maybe here because I'm in a much better position as being the chief president and having this kind of power. if nothing happens to me, I can be empowered to help my people so much more, Lord. So it's right. I can make this good decision over here. Is to do anything contrary to the Word of God ever the right thing? No, it's not, is it? No, it's not. And it's hard for us, to comprehend that at times. We can make a lot of reasons why we think it's maybe okay to kind of go along with something for a little while, thinking we're going to be able to do something. It's for the greater good. I think if you come here on Wednesday night, we may talk a little bit about that in a little more depth. But here we see this. He had to make that choice. Should he be faithful to God and thus save his life? Or maybe seek a way to pray to God in secret? That would be another answer. I don't have to even do that. I'm just going to go in and close all my windows, find a closet where nobody can see me, and I'm going to pray in my closet. That way I can compromise and I can be okay in both situations. But for Daniel, there was only one way. And that was the way to be faithful to the God of heaven. Daniel had over and over again proven his faithfulness. We see it in his diet and the interpretation of the king's dream. We'll look at that in a few minutes. But he did not fear death. He would continue to honor and praise the Lord no matter what the cost. So what did he do? We look in verse 10. It now tells us, it says, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed, and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. Now, the reason he did that, I believe that tradition was set up by David and then followed on by Solomon, where they would pray. When they prayed, they would always pray toward Jerusalem. It wasn't something that's scriptural necessarily. You don't find it in the Bible where it says this is how you're to pray, but we see by example that's how they did pray. And that was their purpose in it. I believe that's when it started. But he followed that tradition. And this is what the conspirators exactly expected him to do. They knew that no decree, even one that would endanger his life, would prevent him from praying daily to his God. He was quite open. His windows were open. Of course, in those days, I know it's hard to believe, but do you believe they don't even have air conditioning back then? Can you believe that? No air conditioning in those days? But anyway, they didn't have air conditioning. They didn't even have cars back then. That's hard to believe, isn't it? But we think about today the things that we have. It's hard to imagine a time when those things weren't. Can you imagine making dinner? We complain we have to go to the grocery store and do this and do that, all the trips we got to make and do this, and sometimes prepare the food, but it's already there for us. We don't have to go out and milk a cow. We don't have to do this. So many things. In those days, the old days, up until about a little over 100 and something years ago, that was pretty standard. That was the way people had to live. But not now. But Daniel's enemies had really misjudged him. In verse 11 it says, then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before God. And as they misjudged him, they were delighted at the success of their scheme. They thought they had sprung the perfect plan or the perfect trap. Now in verse 13 we see, then answered they and said before the king, that Daniel, which is of the children of the captive of Judah, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petitions 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored until the going down of the sun to deliver him. Think about this for a moment. Unfortunately for these conspirators, they had literally trapped the wrong man. They had trapped the king himself with their deceit. And he realized he had just been deceived. In verse 15, he goes on to say, then these men assembled unto the king and said unto the king, know, O king, that the law of the Medes and the Persians is that no decree nor statute which the king established may be changed. Note the contempt. That Daniel, which is of the children of the captive of Judah. What are they saying there? a Jew. And they thought that Daniel's disobedience of the decree would anger the king. And it did that, didn't it? But the anger was not but the anger was not directed at Daniel. No, it was directed at them for their deceit and their lying to force his hand. Darius, I think we can really say, truly loved Daniel. They were very, very close friends. In that very short period of time, they had become extremely close friends. He had complete confidence in Daniel, and he thought the world of Daniel. So much so that he was up all the time trying to see if there was any way he could change this back, or if there was any sort of a loophole that he could use to do this. But he couldn't find one. But there was no way for him to literally get around that law. So at sundown, the enemy of Daniel assembled and demanded that Daniel pay the penalty of the law. And you know something? The king was literally powerless, wasn't he? Yes. 16, verse 16. Then the king commanded, he had to do what he did, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. I don't know about you, but that verse really sticks out to me. This is Darius, the king, saying to Daniel, trust your God, he's going to deliver you. I mean, that's quite a statement. Was he saved? I won't say he was or wasn't. But he certainly knew that Daniel's God could deliver him, didn't he? He knew this about that, and he believed it enough to tell Daniel just to trust your God. He can deliver you. And then verse 17. And a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords. So he not only sealed it himself so that and then somebody could have a question, well, he came back and resealed it. He not only sealed it with his own seal, but he had it sealed with also with his others. He had others seal it with him. So he had it like double sealed. So that was really something that was done. So we see this. Now, was it not Daniel, God, that had delivered his three friends from the fiery furnace? And God had worked a miracle then for that purpose? Now we see he's going to do another miraculous work. Both of these serve as proof of God's omnipotence. Think of the word omnipotence a minute. It means being all-powerful or of literally unlimited power. Now, we can't fathom that, I don't think, here this morning. We can kind of understand because we know what the word means. But for us to fathom unlimited power, being all-powerful above all, even on things that are logically impossible or even are contradictory, all-powerful in things of that nature as well. Everything. He has the power over all. That's what it means. That's who God is. And then in verse 18 it goes on to say, Then the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. Did he love his friend? Was he concerned? He was, wasn't he? Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. He truly loved Daniel. In verse 19 he goes on to say, Then the king rose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. Now I want you to think about the den of lions. The Medes and the Persians were one of the most barbarous type people in reality. I don't know if we get that just from the book of Daniel as we read about them, but they had very little regard for human life. And can you imagine a way of executing being to throw people to lions? Isn't that a horrible way to be executed? That doesn't show much humanity at all, does it? But that was the way that they did it. So this was in a part of the way that they would execute someone. Yes, we saw that. And when he came to the lion's den, he cried with a lamented voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said unto Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions? I think there's a pretty good act of faith there myself. To even think that after being in there all night with those lions that he could go and call on him. You know, to think like that. To me, it just speaks quite a bit about Darius himself. Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. My God has sent his angel, and has shut the lions' mouths, and they have not hurt me. For as much as before him, innocency was found in me. And also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. Then was the king exceeding glad for him, and commanded that he should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no matter of hurt was found upon him, because he believed his God. He believed his God. My friends, do we believe God? You know, there's good things, and I think we do to some extent, but I don't know if we completely trust him in every way. I've certainly failed a lot of times in my life to truly see that kind of faith. But we can have that kind of faith. This wasn't just for Daniel. This is for any true child of God that's willing to truly put their complete faith and confidence in the Lord and know that they can trust him, just as we can trust him for today and for tomorrow, no matter what our challenges are. Then King Darius wrote, so let me finish up. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no matter of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. Then King Darius wrote the book of Daniel, what did I leave out? I left out something here. Yeah, I think I jumped ahead. Okay, I did. I want to go back to that one. Okay. Let me pick this up in verse 24. And then the king commanded that they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and then cast them into the den of lions. Them, their children, and their wives. And the lions had their mastery of them, and break all their bones in pieces, or even before they even came to the bottom of the den. The king gave the commandment. No one had to ask Darius to do this. He didn't have to come out and say, okay, king, why don't you throw those guys in it that were responsible for throwing me in there. He didn't say that. King Darius knew what had happened, and he was angry. And thus he turned the tables. He was ready and willing to bring justice to those who plotted against Daniel, and literally against himself as well, and that they deceived him, and also their children, their families, and their wives. The lions overpowered them before they even came to the bottom of the den. You know, this certainly takes away anything of trying to suggest that for some reason or some other reason that the lions did not consume Daniel. They didn't even hit the bottom before they were gone. This proved that it was genuinely an angelic protection that saved Daniel. It proves that there was no natural reason why the lions did not eat Daniel, and Daniel's accusers perished in the same trap they had set for Daniel. Wow. Just as we saw with Esther in a sense. In Daniel chapter 25 now, in chapter 6, it says, Then Darius wrote unto all people, nations, and language that dwell on the earth, Peace be multiplied unto you. You know, we've looked at that phrase before, hadn't we? Who else said that in Daniel? Wasn't it Nebuchadnezzar? After he came out of his, after he came back and was reestablished on his throne, and he gave his decree. This decree was given, as it tells us here, to all the world. Well, remember how vast the empire of the Medo-Persians was at that time. That was basically the known world in that sense of that day. And the declaration, just as it had been with Nebuchadnezzar, was that this is God. This is the true God. This is the God that is over heaven and over earth, over all kingdoms, and is all-powerful. So we see, in my mind, how God was faithful in the Old Testament to give witness to the Gentiles and the nations, the Gentile nations, of Himself through the Jews, but to Himself. There was a chance. And I think we see that. Going again, when we look at the birth of our we can look at the birth of our Lord and see how those three wise men, this is the area of the world that they came from. Where did they know? How did they know to look for a star? Where did they get all that? They knew more than the, quote, the leadership, the religious leadership of the Jews did at that time. But then it says that then King Darius wrote, "Unto all people, nations, and language that dwell upon the earth, peace be multiplied unto you." Then notice what he does. He makes a decree. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For He is the living God and steadfast forever. And His kingdom, that which shall not be destroyed, and His dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth, and He rescueth, and He worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in the earth, and hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. And so Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So we look at these things. I want to go back up here a minute. I want to pick this up. I got something out of place here. And we see, as we look at the king when he wrote this, we think about how this became, okay? So after he was taken up out of the den of lions, we think how Daniel and his four friends stood firm, thinking just some of the things. Just think about this. Then King Darius wrote, "The book of Daniel follows all familiar patterns. God's people stand firm in their convictions. God honors and protects them. And the testimony of God's work makes the ungodly see and tell of the greatness of God." So we can look at several examples. Think for a minute this morning with me. Daniel and his four friends stood firm, and Nebuchadnezzar saw the fruit of it. That was in chapter 1. Remember what happened in chapter 1? Remember how they were taken captive? They were brought into Babylon, and they were given real privilege. They were going to be raised in the king's house. They were going to get the best of the foods that the king had on his own table, exactly what he was eating. They were going to go to the best schools. They were going to be trained. Nebuchadnezzar had a lot of wisdom about how to run a country. He wanted the best of the best. But we know that Daniel, the Bible tells us in chapter 1, purposed in his heart to do what? To trust God. He purposed even in something like this, which would have been easy again to go along with, which most of them did, except for these four. They didn't do it. They refused to do it, under the threat of death. And then again, we see how God is faithful, because the eunuch that was over them, the captain, he had found favor in his sight to give him a scenario that he could live with, was by feeding them just the pulp or pulse, or whatever it was, for so many days, and then at that point, see if they were any better than the others. And he did, and he found out they were. But he was willing to take that chance, which could have cost him his life. See, God goes before us. And sometimes it's not always the good things, it's the bad things. How many martyrs do we know? How many people have stood? But their home was sure anyway. So we think about those things. But we see that first in Daniel. Next, we see the boldness. We see Daniel's boldly and wisely interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and the king honors Daniel and his God. Remember again, as we just mentioned a minute ago, the power that Nebuchadnezzar had over people. He could just all of a sudden say, well, okay, Bruce, I don't like what you said. Off with your head. Get rid of him. I don't want to see him anymore. He could do that, couldn't he? He had the power to do that. So much so that his other wise men were afraid to tell him, even if they thought they knew it, as they did with the second dream that he has. They kind of think that they could have probably interpreted that. Many commentators think so. But they wouldn't, because they were feared of the king. If they told him what was going to happen, that they would be killed. So they were afraid to do it. Daniel wasn't. He stood firm. Then, of course, we all know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how they stood firm and how they gave God the glory. And then the big thing about this is that Nebuchadnezzar, at that time, even though it was brief, gave God the glory, didn't he? He recognized it, and he did it again. What a great witness. Before all of his leadership, all of the people that were anybody in his kingdom were there and witnessed this with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They saw them being thrown into the fire. They saw it being heated up. They saw the king in amazement when he saw the 4 instead of the 3 that were in it, and saw them brought out without any harm done to them at all. And then they also saw, to prove the fire was really there and really hot, again we have an absolute witness, because what happened to the guys that threw them in? They got consumed, didn't they? Yes. Again, we see how God's working. And then Daniel boldly told, and then Daniel stood firm and boldly and told Belshazzar the truth too, as we know at the end, well, in the writing on the wall. The point is plain. We should stand firm in godly convictions and honor God even when it costs everything or something. Others will see the testimony and be impressed. In other words, when we actually do things like that, others see our actions as Christians, and it has an impact on them. Now, I will say this, for some it's a positive impact, and for others it's a negative impact. It can be a negative impact in the sense that it causes them to hate you just the more, hate the truth even more. It can be a positive impact in that they say, wow, what is that? How is that? And what a testimony. And they desire to know what it is that basically makes you tick. Now we go on. See the testimony given an impression. But now look at verse 24. And the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions. Them, their children, their wives, and the lions had the mastery of them, and they brake all their bones in pieces, before even they came to the bottom of the pit. The king gave the command. No one had asked Darius to do this, as we just looked at. He was ready and willing to bring justice. And we saw how they were overpowered. And this, again, proves that how the angelic being was there, as Daniel had said, and protected him. But now in verse 25 we read, Then King Darius wrote unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell upon the earth, peace be unto you. We looked at that decree. Okay, now I'll pick it up at the end of that. I'm going to read that again just so we have just so we have it in perspective. He said, I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before God, the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and steadfast forever, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in the heavens and in the earth, who have delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. And we saw how Daniel prospered in both Darius and Cyrus's reign. So then, looking at Daniel, one of the greatest blessings to come from Daniel 6 is to see the story unfold and how it literally points to Jesus. Let us consider a few things here. He was a man without blame, faithful to God in all of his ways, a man noted for prayer, was sent to his death because of jealousy of those who wanted to prevent his exaltation. Does that not remind you of the Lord? Next, he was condemned to death by the plotting of his enemies and the law of the land, and thrown into a stone room meant for his doom. And then we see a stone. There's not one rolled over the Lord's tomb. And also with Daniel we see. And then we see a stone was rolled over the opening. But in all its power and ferocity, death couldn't touch him. And then on the morning, the stone was rolled away. He came out victorious. He glorified God. The pagans gave honor to God, and his enemies were judged. That's a pretty good story, isn't it? The story of both Daniel and Jesus the Messiah, which is truly true. Now we have a little bit of time left here this morning. I'd like to open it up to you for any kind of comments, or if you have a question or anything that we can you'd like to discuss at this point. Anybody? Yes. Yeah, I wasn't thinking. You know, it's like to me, I can see the flattery getting to him, but I don't think he was all good either. But not to misunderstand, because I don't even know necessarily if he would be saved. I think he could have been, would have been. They told him it was all. He wanted to believe it. No, sometimes we accept things because what we're told we want to believe anyway, right? We want to believe that that's true. No, you got something. I'm really I didn't see. That's exactly right. That's excellent. Anybody else? I think a lot of that has to do with his absolute truth. Yeah. It reminds me, it's just that what people will say. Well, all we can do is pray. What's that mean?
That's the most we can do.
No, what they're saying is we've tried everything else, but all that we've tried, that's not working. So let's just try the last resort. Let's ask God if He'll help us. Which is, it should be the first and not the last. Is where we come with that. That's an excellent point too. Somebody else? Anybody else?